In a previous video, I explained how you can identify if you have an unwanted person or a hacker connected to your home network. In this episode, we're going to take a slightly different approach. Because after all, your home network will be more secure if you can prevent these hackers or unwanted people from connecting to your home network in the first place. It's like they always say, the best defense is, well, a good defense. So in this episode from Network from Home, I'm going to be walking you through the steps you can follow to secure your home network, and specifically how you can secure the router in your home network. I'll take the approach as if you're unboxing and implementing a new router for the first time, but keep in mind that if you have a router up and running now, you can follow these same steps to make sure your router is as secure as possible. In this episode, I'm going to be securing an Archer AX10 router. These steps, if you have a different make and model of your router, they will largely be very similar. After all, these security settings are pretty universal. Just about every router has these same settings, so you'll be able to follow along no matter what router you have. All right, we've connected our Archer AX10 router to our modem. We're ready to get started here. We need to access our router settings, but in order to do that, we need to first access one of these default Wi-Fi networks that the AX10 router is broadcasting. So let's go down here. Available networks. We'll connect to the 5G network right here. We're now connected to one of the Wi-Fi networks of the router that we want to secure. So now we need to get to the router settings. I've previously made a video detailing how to do this, so I'll jump to that point. If you're not sure how to access your router settings page, check out that video first and then come back and join us here for the rest of the steps. All right, here we are at the login page for my router settings. Because I'm accessing my router settings for the first time, with my router, I need to set a password to access these settings. Just make sure if given this opportunity and you're required to set up a password for your router settings at the start, that you select something that is complex. Only you know it, you couldn't randomly guess it. So let's go in and set that password now. Once you have that password set, let's get started. Here there are some quick setup steps for the router. I'm just going to buzz through these and get to the router settings homepage, and then we'll walk through all the security settings that you need to worry about. The first thing we need to do, and it's singularly the most important thing you can do to secure your router settings, we need to make sure that you're not using the default username and password to access your router settings. As you saw with my router, I obviously had to set my own unique password when I accessed my router settings for the first time. But if your router has a default username and password that you're currently using to access your router settings, you need to go and change it. This is especially the case with older routers. So let's go in, let's make sure that we have a unique password for your router settings. Here we need to go into the advanced settings. From here, we're going to jump down to the System tab. And underneath that, we're going to select Administration. As you can see right up top here, you have the opportunity to set a new password for your router settings. So let's just say I was using the default password for my router settings. Here's where you go and you type a new one. All right, we have a new password typed in there. Let's hit save to make sure these changes lock in. The next most important thing you can do is to take a look at the Wi-Fi networks that your router's broadcasting. So we want to jump up here to wireless. Here in your wireless network settings, you have the opportunity to secure your router in a number of ways. First and foremost is looking at the default Wi-Fi networks that this router broadcasts. These default wireless networks, they indicate the manufacturer of your router. You want to make sure you don't have your manufacturer or the model of your router in the Wi-Fi network name. That just gives the hacker an idea of what type of router you have. If there's a specific vulnerability for a specific router, they might be looking for that make and model because they know how to exploit it. So what we want to do here, we want to create unique Wi-Fi networks for your home. What I'm going to do for the 2.4 network from home 2G, and then for the 5G, we're going to do the same nomenclature. Now we don't have any identifying information in the Wi-Fi networks. We're good to go there. The next thing we want to look at, obviously, is these passwords. These passwords were default passwords that came with the router. So what you want to do is you want to make sure you just change this to, again, something unique that only you know. So first we'll change the 2.4 gigahertz network. And then what we'll do the same password for the 5G network here. And these are both unique passwords. Ideally, you'd pick something a little more secure than secure password. This is just an example, but put in here whatever you want for your Wi-Fi network's password. The next thing we want to look at is the security of our Wi-Fi networks. Here, it might look a little bit confusing, but all of these are different algorithms and protocol for encrypting the traffic between your devices and your router. The one you want to select here, if given the option, is WPA3 Personal and WPA2 PSK AES. So the AES is the encryption algorithm that's used. That's the strongest one available. You want to make sure you're using AES. And the other one is the protocol that's being used. WPA3, that's the newest protocol, but a lot of devices still use WPA2. So that's why we have to have this WPA3 plus WPA2. If a device can't handle WPA3, it will use WPA2 and you'll be good to go. This will cover you for any sort of device that you have in your home with the strongest encryption possible. So we're going to select that for both networks. The next thing you see quite often when people talk about securing their Wi-Fi networks is they say that your Wi-Fi network is more secure if you hide it. So here you have the option to hide your Wi-Fi networks. I've actually made another video talking about hiding your Wi-Fi network and explaining how it actually doesn't make your Wi-Fi network any more secure. So I advise just you don't need to hide these for now. While you're in your network settings, if you scroll down a little bit, here you have the option to enable a guest network. I advise that you do this so that way anyone that's visiting your home, they connect to your guest Wi-Fi network. So we'll be generous here. We'll enable a 5G guest network. Again, we're going to change the network name. We don't want the router's manufacturer in the network name. We're not going to hide the Wi-Fi network name. For security here, we're going to choose the same thing that we chose for the other two Wi-Fi networks that are broadcast, WPA2, WPA3 Personal. Keep in mind here for your guest Wi-Fi network, you want a different password than what you use for your other two Wi-Fi networks. If it's the same password, then you're basically giving your guests access to your other networks. You want to make sure that you're keeping these separate, so you want a separate password for the guest network. Once you have that locked in, you want to hit save. One thing to keep in mind is that when you change the Wi-Fi names that are being broadcast by your router, you have to go in and reconnect to your router's Wi-Fi network. So here we are, we'll go in, we'll connect to this Wi-Fi network. Network from home, we'll select the 5G, and then we'll type in the password that we selected for the network. Another thing I forgot to mention is that there are a few additional settings when it comes to your guest network that you want to make sure are disabled. In order to access them, you have to go into the Advanced tab. Under Wireless, see Guest Network. And here are the two things that I'm talking about. Allow guests to see each other and allow guests to access your local network. You want to make sure these are both unchecked or disabled. The last thing you want is for guests in your home network that are on your guest network to be able to either communicate with each other or to be able to access your local network, access your router settings. There's a reason you set up a guest Wi-Fi network, and that's because you want to keep those devices separate from the rest of your network. That's why you don't want to keep these boxes checked. The next thing we want to look at here is the remote management settings for your router. You want to make sure that your router is not publicly accessible by anyone on the internet, and you don't want people to be able to make changes to your router from anywhere other than your home network. So here we go into Advanced again. We go down to System. We go back to Administration here. Scrolling down, Remote Management. You just want to make sure that's disabled. Do not enable this because that way it will make your router publicly discoverable and potentially accessible if someone knows or guesses the password to your router settings. The next thing we want to look at here is WPS, or Wi-Fi Protected Setup. You can find that up here under Wireless, WPS. WPS, it doesn't represent the hugest security risk because the window of exploitation of your home network is pretty small. I went into depth on this topic in another video, but just for now, keep in mind, if you're not going to be using WPS, it should be disabled in your router. If you're going to be using WPS, however, you should enable it for the short period of time that you're going to use it, and then you should disable it again. Again, not the hugest security risk, but I won't be using WPS, so we're going to disable it. The next thing we want to look at, it should already be enabled, but we want to look at your router's firewall. So under these advanced settings, if you go to security, firewall, here it's just how we want it to be. The SPI firewall should be enabled. This basically is just another layer of protection when it comes to the devices on your home network. It doesn't let these random devices on the public internet connect to the devices in your home network. On top of that, the option for responding to pings from LAN. This isn't a huge risk. It's basically if you have devices in your home network, you want to make sure they can access your router. So you can get a little complicated. You can send a ping command to your router to see if it responds. You know if it responds that the connection is in place and it's working properly. That's why I keep this enabled. I trust all the devices in my home network and they pose very little security risk because I know what all these devices are. The next thing we want to do is we want to make sure your router's firmware is updated. So here under the advanced settings, we go to System, Firmware Update. Next, we want to check for updates. All right, it looks like our router's firmware is up to date, but it's of critical importance that you periodically go in and you check to make sure if your router has any firmware updates. That's because a lot of these firmware updates, they provide patches to vulnerabilities that are found for your router. So for example, if your router has a known bug or a security vulnerability that lets a hacker take control of your router, what will happen is the manufacturer, TP-Link, will put out new firmware that patches this vulnerability. That's why you need to make sure you're updating your firmware. This is the one security setting that you need to periodically go in and check. It's not a one set and forget like the rest of these settings. You want to make sure that you build a habit of doing this every few months or so. On top of that, if your router has the option for automatically updating when new firmware is available, I suggest you implement that just so you don't have to worry about this. There's one last setting I almost forgot about here, but it's of utmost importance that we want to make sure that universal plug and play is disabled on your router. I thought by default it would be disabled, but in going to my router's settings, I find out that it's actually enabled by default. In order to get to these settings over here, we want to go to NAT forwarding, UPnP. As you can see, it's enabled here. Universal plug and play essentially allows your devices to open ports in your firewall. You don't want to do this unless you have a specific use case for it, and it's a little more complex. So for most people, you can just disable this and you don't have to worry about it. So let's do that now. All right, at this point, your router should be pretty ironclad when it comes to these security settings. If you have any questions about any of these settings, please drop a comment below. If you found this video useful and your router is more secure because of it, I invite you to like the video. That way it gets shared with other people who can benefit from this information as well. And lastly, if you like the type of videos I put out on my channel, I invite you to subscribe. That way you'll get to see every time I put out a new weekly video, and you'll have additional benefits for your home network. As always, thanks for checking out this episode from Network from Home, and we'll catch you on the next one.